Hello, my name is Xander and welcome back to the Nginx Mastery Series. This is the fourth tutorial in this video series. If you haven't found the other tutorials, then just head over to the main homepage, go to playlists, and you'll find a tutorial series called Nginx Mastery. And from there, you can then start from the very beginning of this tutorial series. If you haven't watched any of the previous tutorials, don't worry, you can start from this tutorial. There is a link in the video description which will take you to the code or the base code so that you can follow along in this tutorial. In this tutorial, we take a look at using Nginx as a reverse proxy. We are going to be utilizing the Django framework as a way of demonstrating this functionality. But we aren't going to solely focus on actually deploying Django here, but it is going to be part of this process. So here in this tutorial then, Nginx, what we focus on is the idea of building a reverse proxy. So I will try and give you some background information. Although we're using the Django framework here, this can apply to other technologies. Some other topics that we need to understand in order to set this up: how to remap URLs to different directories other than the root location. So here in the Django project, we are going to need to set up static files. So that gives us an opportunity to understand that. Now, because we are using a reverse proxy, that allows us to understand a little bit about the upstream module. So we go through that. And then in addition to that, Django also provides a default admin site. Now we might want to protect that from others accessing it. So here we'll just go through the basics of IP address location security. Django's primary deployment platform is WSGI, the Python standard for web servers and applications. So therefore, we are going to need a WSGI server. In this case, we're going to be utilizing Gunicorn. So let me just take you through a visual representation of what we're going to be developing in this tutorial. So we have our browser here. It's an optional step, but what we're going to do is build a DNS server locally. So we're going to send a signal over to that. We'll have a domain name, whatever you might want to choose there, and that's going to send a signal back. So now we have the IP address of our server, our web server. So we then fire off a signal then to our Nginx server. So these boxes here the outer boxes refer to containers that we're going to be building in Docker. So we send our signal over to our Nginx server, and then this is going to act as a reverse proxy. In this scenario, what our proxy server is going to do, our reverse proxy server is going to do here is going to pass messages over to, in this case, Gunicorn. So Gunicorn then is, or Green Unicorn, is a Python WSGI HTTP server. And that is essentially going to be able to communicate with our Django application. Both Gunicorn and Django are going to be installed on the same container here. And essentially what's going to happen is that HTTP requests are going to be passed into Gunicorn, and then that's going to be allowed to then communicate with the Django application, and then the Django application can then send back data through Gunicorn over to our server here, our Nginx server, back to the browser. And that's how the web page is going to be served. So like many web pages or many websites, we are going to have static files, JavaScript files, CSS files, and images maybe. So in this case, static files can be served directly from our Nginx server. So we are going to store the static files on the Nginx server or in the container. So we aren't going to need to necessarily go through the Gunicorn server here to access those files. So we will, in addition, set up the static files on the Nginx server here to be served directly from this container. So there is a link in the video description that would take you over to the Nginx series repository, and then what you're going to need is the part 3. So we're going to work from the part 3 code and build upon that. So there is some code that's already been developed, some containers, etc. So if you do want to go back and have a look at that, please go back to the previous tutorials and learn how to develop that. But we will be working from that, and you can work from this tutorial onwards. So you don't necessarily need to go back to understand what it is we're doing in this tutorial, but it can be handy to have that underpinning knowledge. If you are following along with the code, this is what we've just downloaded from the third tutorial repository. So we have a folder for DNS and a folder for Nginx. We have the commands file, which I just throw in a load of commands that we've utilized throughout the tutorial series so far. Just makes it easy and handy for you. And then the Docker Compose file. So that can just consist at the moment of an Nginx instance. And also we created a local DNS server. You can see from the Docker Compose file, we're utilizing a few different volumes. That's just making it easy for us to actually manage our instances of Nginx and DNS to have the actual files locally here. So this is why we're using volumes here to mirror across. If you're not familiar with volumes in Docker, essentially we're just going to mirror across these folders that are defined here over to our containers so we can easily access critical or core components that we might want to change or configure as we go through the tutorial. So this isn't necessarily something that you would have there if you were going to deploy this to your server, just for development. So let's get started. We're going to create a new folder for our Django installation. So we're just going to call this Django. And then we'll go ahead and create a new virtual environment. So here on my Mac, so Windows is the same command. So create a virtual environment. If you're not too sure how to create virtual environments, there are individual tutorials on the site, on the YouTube channel. Just type user search in the channel to search for VENV, and that should take you to Windows or Mac installation guide. Right, so on a Mac here, I need to type in source. I don't need to do that on Windows. So let's go into bin and activate. Again, if you're on Windows, it's going to be venv and then source and then activate. So I think it's source and activate, top of my head. So let's get that activated. So we have that now activated, and then we can go ahead and just pip install Django. So we're not going to build a Django project here. We're just going to use the default. So now we have Django installed. Let's go ahead. Apologies if you can't see my terminal. There we go. You see the whole terminal now. Now we've got that. Let's go ahead and actually go inside of this folder. So we're going to need to change directory into this folder. And then we go ahead and start a new Django project. So Python 3 start. Oh, actually, apologies, Django admin, start project. And then we're just going to call this demo. Okay, so don't forget the full stop to denote the fact we want to start the project inside of the folder, which we're currently inside. Okay, so we've now got a new project. So let's go ahead. We've got the manage.py file now, so we can utilize that to just migrate. Okay, so that just basically sets up the database and all the other tables that are needed to get started. Though it's not necessarily needed, we've done that. And then in addition to that, what we're going to do is create our static files. So if you're not familiar, static files are essentially, they can be CSS files or JavaScript files or images, static files that the web page might need. Now we're just going to get them auto-generated, because if we are going to be utilizing the admin panel in production, then we are going to need to have all the CSS files, etc. Here in development, what's happening here is that all those CSS files are in the actual Django installation that we downloaded. So if we go into venv here, for example, and we're looking for projects in the library here, go to Django, and we went to admin, we could find all the CSS files there. So that's what we downloaded initially when we installed Django. So in a local environment, that's what's going to be utilized. But when we go into development, we are going to want to copy those across into a static folder so that we can utilize them on our deployment server. Our production server, sorry. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we're going to type in Python 3 manage.py, and then the command for this is collect static. So we'll go ahead and do that. Just type yes, no problem. So what we should have now inside of our folder is a static folder. Oh, we don't have a static root. Apologies. We need to do that first. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside of our Django project, apologies, go to settings, and we just need to set up our static root. Now you can see here that static URL has already been set up, so we can add a slash here if we like, but we need to set up the static root first. Apologies. So what we have here essentially is this is the URL that's going to be utilized to access the static folder, but in actual fact, it's not going to be actually stored in a folder called static. the actual static files are going to be in a folder called static files. So they don't have to be, but this is just the default. So what we need to do is also just define exactly where to find the files on the system. So that's going to be the base directory, which is defined at the top of this file, and then slash, and then we're going to create a folder called static files, and that's just the default folder that's created in Django. Files. There we go. So now we have that in place. Apologies. We can now go ahead and run collect static, and you can see that we now have this static files created with our CSS, fonts, images, and JavaScript. And just by default, like I said, that's needed for the admin panel. Or sorry, the Django admin site. Because we are working towards the idea of actually deploying, let's go ahead and set up a new folder here, and let's create our environment variables. So inside of here, we might have multiple environment variables. So one for development, one for production, and so on. We'll just create a new file here. I'm just going to call this development.env. And inside of here, I'm going to set up some different variables. So for example, we could set up a secret key. That would be one thing maybe we set in our environment variables. And if you're not familiar with environment variables, this allows us to essentially remove some of the critical or sensitive information that would be found in our settings file. Because if anyone were to kind of break into our website and they knew that we're using Django, potentially that's the first place they'll look for some information that they could use to really perform some damage. And so what we're trying to do here is just hide the secret key. And also what we can do is define or redefine the allowed host, and also set the debug, for example. So inside here, we're going to set the secret key, we're going to set the allowed hosts, and then also let's change debug or define debug. Okay, so secret key then, I'm just going to copy and paste a random secret key I think that the project is using. Allowed hosts. So there's a few different allowed hosts maybe that you want to set up here. So we're using the name and space. So name and space, so you can see here I've defined the local host, and we're going to be utilizing a domain called main.com through our DNS server that we're going to set up locally. So we're going to set that too, and that's pretty much it there. So let's go back to the top. Let's just get rid of this. We're going to need to import OS, and then we'll go ahead and change some of these different settings here. So the secret key. So now we're utilizing the secret key in our environment variable. So we're going to need to define the fact we're doing that. So os dot environment.get, and then we just need to find our secret key. So what we're doing secret key. There we go. Okay, so in addition to that, we also set up debug and allowed hosts. So let's just do the allowed host first. So they were separated by, inside of here, they're separated by spaces. So we get and then allowed hosts. And then what we do is a split. There you go. So that will then be utilized in the allowed hosts. Set that up nicely for us. And then the debug here, we're going to be utilizing integers instead of true or false. So os.environ again, .get, and then we're going to say debug, and then we'll set the default to 0. There we go. Now, by default, this won't work locally because we've made these changes here, and it won't pick up the environment variables locally. So it will need to be worked and utilized within our container. So we were going to try it out, but obviously we can't at this point. This is being set up to be utilized in our container. So what we need to do now then is, that's pretty much it for that. Let's go back into our Docker Compose file. And I'm just going to highlight or comment out, everything that we've done so far. And I'm just going to set out a new service called web or Django, whatever you like. And then next up, we'll go for a build. So here, for some reason, I use context. I don't have to. You could do it directly after the build statement there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new Docker file inside of the Django folder. And inside of here, I'm going to just define what's going to be needed to get this service running. And it's really quite simple. So from Python, what are we on? Should go for 3.9. Alpine. So we're going to set our working directory inside of a container. So it's going to be user src app. And then we need to set up some environment variables or environment settings. Just to speed things up here, because I probably said this many times if you've looked at or watched any of the other tutorials, kind of irrelevant for this tutorial, but we've got some different environment variables. So we're going to run and install an upgrade, and then we're going to copy across a requirements file to the container and then run that so that we can run Django in the container. And then we're just going to copy everything across to that container. So we are using the working directory, so everything's going to be copied across to there. So that's pretty much it for that. We do need to remember to create a requirements file. Now, here I'm inside of this folder, the Django folder. So make sure you're in the right directory before you do this. But I'm going to run pip freeze to create a requirements file. Okay, so that basically just defines the packages that are going to be needed in order to run Django in the container. Right, so that's that done now. So go back into the compose file. So we've got the context there, which is essentially just telling Docker to have a look at that file and run everything from that file. So once that's in place, we're then going to need to make sure it then runs. So we'll just test this first. So we'll run a command to actually get things running. So that's going to be python manage.py and then run server. So we're going to run server and make it available. So 0000, and then that's going to run on port 8000. That's pretty much all we need there. We are going to need some volumes. So what we can do is if we wanted to work on our Django application while we had this set up, we could set up a volume to do that. So let's say /Django. So remember, this file is here, and we need to go into the Django folder, and we want to copy that folder over, although it will be anyway, but this will allow us to work on it live as we run the container. So that's going to be user/src. Remember, this is where we copied across everything in the Docker file. Back here, we copied everything across over to this folder. So we're just basically going to make a volume which is basically mirroring everything across from here over to the container so that we can work with it as we run the container. So that's that in place. And then what we can do then is just define some ports. So we're going to open up port 8000 in the container and make it available so we can access port 8000 in the container where our server is running. Right, so I think that's pretty much it for now. Actually, we have the environment file. So that was /. So remember / this directory / defining a folder. The folder is called .env, and then inside of that we've got a file called dev.env. Okay, so that just makes it the environment file available, so it can then be utilized via Django for defining the settings in the settings file. Now remember here, the whole point of these environment files here is that this won't be accessible by anyone. This will be in the background, and then Django can get this data from the server. And the idea is that we're kind of hiding these important information, sensitive information, so that if anyone did hack in to our website, to our server, it makes it harder for them to actually see this sensitive information. So I make the assumption you have downloaded Docker Desktop. If you haven't, then go ahead and download Docker Desktop, install it. This is potentially what you're going to be looking at once you've installed Docker Desktop. So once that's installed, I do also have the Docker extension in Visual Studio Code. Just type in Docker into the extensions here and download Docker. And then you'll get a new little icon here and you'll be able to manage all the containers and images from this tab here. Right, so we're ready just to bring up everything. So let's just say Docker compose and then build. So we'll create our image. You can see that there are some issues here in our file. So let's take a look at what is wrong here. So options command. Oh, okay. So I've tabbed that out. I didn't need to do that. So let's go back and build. We don't need to use build. We could just say up here and it would just build and then start the container. But that's going to basically download the image. We defined we're using Alpine, which is a fairly lightweight image. Everything looks okay. So let's go ahead and up. That will bring up the container. So in a second, this will refresh. So we have our image that we just created. And now we brought up a container. It looks okay. So let's go ahead and just test this out, see if it works. So in your browser, let's just type in 127.0.0.8000, and there we go. So everything looks absolutely fine. So what we've got so far then is our browser. We created a new container, and then inside of that we have the Django instance. And then we started the server, which is essentially just a Python lightweight server, which will allow us to communicate and work with Django in development. So that's exactly what we have so far. Now we want to obviously work towards this diagram. So next up, let's go ahead and install Gunicorn and get everything started with Gunicorn. And then we go ahead and we're bringing the Nginx server, set that up, and then set up the static files and so on. And then finally we go ahead and it really is just an optional step, setting up our local DNS server so that we can serve it the website from our domain. So I'm just going to press Control-C just to close that server there. Right, so we don't need that. We don't need that. So back into our files here, let's go into requirements. So we are going to now also need to install Gunicorn. So I'm just going to do this manually. The latest version being, I think it's 20.1. So go ahead and have a look. But I think the latest version as of recording is 20.1.0. So that's now in the requirements file. So what I need to do now is just make sure. So I'll go into my containers here in Docker Desktop. I'm just going to delete the image that we created. Just keep everything nice and fresh. Some of these steps aren't necessarily needed, but I'm just doing this just to make sure that everyone will have the same experience. Okay, so we don't have any containers or images left. Remember, we need to delete the containers first before we get rid of the images. So let's go back into our code here and we'll run this again. But this time what we do is we'll just remove this command. We'll just add a new command. So instead of running the lightweight Python built-in server, let's go ahead now and actually run the Gunicorn server. Now, ultimately, this isn't necessarily how you're going to run Gunicorn on your server, but just for this scenario, we're going to set it up in this very simplistic way. So we're just basically setting Gunicorn up here to start. So we're going to bind to 0.0.0.8000. So essentially what we've done here is we've started Gunicorn. We've identified the application that we want to attach it to, and then we basically set the IP address which we're going to serve the application on. And that basically now runs the Gunicorn server. So remember, it's going to be installed because we set up the requirements file. So let's just go back and we'll do another build. But this time we're not going to do a build. We're just going to do up straight away because that's going to build and bring up the container all at once. So we'll give that a go. So that'll take us a couple of seconds. And then what we're going to find is that the server is now running. So this is a new setup we have. So we just basically replaced the Python server with Gunicorn. So when we now go into the browser and refresh, taking its time. Let's think about it. And then eventually it works. Not too sure what happened there. I just opened up a new tab and I refreshed. It looks like it's okay. It's taking its time, isn't it? Interesting. Let's try it again. Yeah, I think it's definitely working. So we can definitely check. Let's go back into the code here. Not found. So it can't find the static files because we've not set them up yet. That isn't the problem. Maybe that's why it was taking a little bit of time. Okay. Let's go back and just make a refresh. Okay, so if we try to go into the admin, let's just test this out. What's going to happen is we will be able to access the admin, but the admin requires some CSS files and some other images and JavaScript. And of course, that isn't accessible at the moment. And this is why you're seeing this this page without any style. So we're going to need to sort that out shortly. But let's first of all focus on Nginx. So the question you probably have at this point is, well, why do I need two servers? Why do I need Gunicorn and Nginx? So Gunicorn, I like to think of it as an application server. It's providing, in this case, a service of, loosely speaking, translating the requests that are coming from the browser into something that Django can actually work with, and vice versa. So Django can't directly talk to the server, the web server. It needs some sort of communication intermediate tool or service, and that's Gunicorn. Nginx, on the other hand, is a fully fledged optimized web server. So what one can do, the other can't. So they go nicely hand in hand. It isn't the only server that you can utilize here, Gunicorn. There are others. Same with Nginx. Maybe you wanted to use, for example, Apache, or many of the others that I mentioned in the first tutorial. Just thinking about features that Nginx is going to provide, for example, the security that it offers. So it's going to help you protect, so it's going to protect your website from denial of service attacks, or it can do, whereas Gunicorn doesn't necessarily have those tools. So both of these tools work hand in hand nicely. Now, one of the questions that you probably might have is, well, having two services here, isn't that just going to slow things down? Not necessarily. That isn't necessarily something that you need to be worrying about at this point. Think of them as complementary pieces of software or services that are really kind of performing different roles. So let's get this set up. Now, we've already commented out the Nginx configuration. So let's just bring that back on. So here we have the context here, or the build information. So let's just go into the folder. Let's get rid of that. And you can see we have a Docker file. If you haven't seen the previous tutorials, all we've done here is we're using the Nginx latest image, and then we're making a few changes. So we're just copying across everything from the HTML folder here. And we don't actually need to do that now. So we could actually remove that. So that was in the previous tutorial where we're just setting up static web pages. So we can definitely get rid of that. We don't actually need this either. In actual fact, you could say we don't actually need the Docker file at all, because we're just going to use the default Nginx setup for this. So we could just use or bring in the image into the Docker Compose file, but I'm just going to keep them separate for now. Let's just keep that on there for now. I don't need this HTML folder anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of that. Like I said, if you're interested in setting up static files, have a look at the previous tutorials. That would take you through that. So in addition to that then, let's go back in. So we're going to set this up on port 80. So it's going to be working on port 80. So at the moment, I think, yeah, I think we're okay with that. The volume, so you can see here the volumes have two volumes, so we don't need this anymore. So we're just going to map across to the configuration file. So it just makes it easier for us to set up the configuration file and make any changes. So that's why we're going to create a volume there. I think that's pretty much it that we need to do at this minute. So let's just take a look at what we're going to be doing here. So we've got a browser. We're going to be sending a request over. That's going to be utilizing port 80. So that's just the default HTTP port, right? So the default web port for sending HTTP traffic, web traffic. So we opened up port 80 on the container. So port 80 is now open on the container. So we're going to pass in data into the container through port 80. Now, Gunicorn is currently set up on port 8000. So what we're going to need to do here is set up Nginx to basically just forward things across on maybe a different port. So we're going to forward things across on port 8000. So that's what's going to happen there. So that's what we want to do. We want to forward all the information across on port 8000. And then, of course, port 8000 in our container is open. So it's accepting requests on port 8000 or listening on port 8000. And then we can just do what it normally does. Gunicorn can take over and then request the files, and then we can send all the data back. So that's how the ports are going to work here. We're using the default port 80 port on our server, and then that's going to be then converted, if you like, or sent across on port 8000. And our container here holding Django and Gunicorn is open on port 8000, and everything works nicely. So you don't have to use these port numbers, of course. Obviously, port 80 is the default port for HTTP traffic, so you might want to use that. But in the back here, you could set this to port 80. You could set it to any of the other available ports that you want to utilize. So now we need to set up Nginx as a reverse proxy. So a proxy server, you may have come across this before, you may not. Essentially, it's a go-between or a kind of intermediate server that forwards requests. And that's essentially what's going to happen here. So we're going to send a request to our server. It's then going to send the message across over to our other container. This nice little setup is going to enable us later in further tutorials to start thinking about cache or cache, depending on what part of the world you're from. In addition to that, you're starting to see some of the layers of security we can start to now apply, because we can see here we have a proxy server, a reverse proxy server, and our Nginx server, we can do a whole heap of different things here in terms of security. And this is just going to provide one layer of security. Normally this server is going to be behind a firewall, and also that's going to be within the operating system. So your operating system may have a firewall, and then there might be an outer firewall. So there's loads of different layers here that you're starting to see in terms of security. That, of course, is just expanding and adding to the complexity of this whole deployment process. And it is a big process, ultimately, if you want to do this properly. And now I get a lot of questions on how do you deploy this on a production server, expecting me to be able to explain every single component that you might want to configure. And I'm just really trying to suggest that this is a very big process indeed. So let's move on now and configure our Nginx server. So as I suggested, the main configuration file, if you're not familiar with this, is going to be the default.config file. And we are using a volume, so we're mirroring across to where the config file is stored in the container. So we do have it here. This is the current setup. So I'm just going to comment this out. We don't need that. So here on my keyboard, I've typed or used command / depending whether you're using Windows or Mac. That just comments everything out if you're not familiar with that. So let's give this a go. So we're going to need a server block. Okay, so we are listening on port 80, remember? That's what we know so far. So we're going to listen to port 80, and then we want to do something. So we're acting as a reverse proxy or a proxy, so we want to pass data across to somewhere. So we use, location, so /, so that's kind of like the incoming location, right? So if we go to the home page, then basically we want to send them somewhere else, right? So where do we want to send them? So we want to use proxy pass, and I think that makes sense. Where do we want to pass them? So proxy pass, and then we basically define where we want to pass them. So we say /demo. Okay, so we give it a name of demo. It's name kind of place where we're going to send them. And then that can then act as a reference point for us to define our upstream. Okay, so upstream, essentially here we're referring to somewhere where we want to send this information upstream. So that's going to be demo, and that matches our demo here, right? So upstream, and then we can just define where we want to send it. So server, our server is called web. So if we go back into here, we've called our instance here web, and then we want to use port 8000. And there we go. So essentially what we've done here, we said when we go to the homepage, when someone requests our website, we want to basically pass them over upstream to the server on port 8000. Now there's great expandability here, many different options here. Now notice we did use web as a reference to our web container here, but that might be replaced by the actual domain name of where our server might actually be resolving to. So we could use DNS there to resolve exactly where the server is. It could be an IP address, for example. And here we can start to use a whole different setup. We could start to use, for example, weights. We may have multiple servers reference. Yeah, there's a whole heap of things here that we can set up, but this is really just a basic baseline for us to start understanding what's happening here. Again, hopefully in further tutorials, we'll start to expand this and learn a little bit more, and I'll start to drip feed more information. So we are going to want some information from the client to travel all the way from the client, potentially, to the server so that we can maybe perform different actions. So what's happening here, let's just think about this logically. The browser or the user may have an IP address, 82.1.1.32. Maybe that's their internet address, their browser. So when the browser makes a request to the server for a web page, a whole host of information is sent over to the server. One of them might be the IP address of the user. Now, the thing is, this IP address is read, and then Nginx then sends that data across. Now, because Nginx is essentially then sending that across to the backend or this other set of servers here, it might be that Nginx has a different IP address. Maybe it has a different IP address here. And then what happens is that Nginx sends a signal over to these servers here and Django, and then it uses its own IP address. So what happens is that Django thinks that the original request is coming from this IP address here and not the IP address of the browser. So that might not necessarily be a big problem, but there'll be occasions potentially where you do want to forward everything from the browser over to your server. So it just happens the X-forward4 or XFS request header is kind of the de facto standard header for identifying the originating IP address of the client. So potentially we want a way of kind of forwarding that across from the Nginx server across to maybe the Django client, so it can then maybe perform different actions based upon the original IP address of the user. So back in the code here, we could potentially set proxy set header X-forward4, proxy add X-forward4. So essentially here what we're doing is passing across the original IP address of the user over to Django. And then of course the Django API can then determine the original client's IP address instead of the IP address of the proxy. So there's a whole heap of other aspects here that we can utilize. And if you're looking for more information in Google, if you just type in Nginx _HTTP _proxy _module, that would take you to a page, the Nginx documentation, and it will show all the different things you can pass over. So let's just go ahead and now just pass through the host. So proxy set header host host. This value equals the server name in the host request header field, or the primary server name if the field is not present. Okay, so with these settings, let's give this a go, see if it works. So we're just going to close everything down. And at the moment, we don't actually have this image set, so we don't need to shut everything down here. We have the image here for the proxy, Nginx proxy web. Okay, so that's our web server. So let's just go ahead and Docker up. So that should then go ahead and build the new image for our Nginx server and then start it. Okay, so you can just see that our Nginx server just came up. So hopefully now we can go through the server and access our web page. So back in the browser then, let's just see if, for instance, see if this still works. So you can still see that the 8000 port still works. We can go directly. Let's just do it without 8000. And you can see that the site cannot be reached. Now remember, we aren't trying to use port 80 here. So you would imagine that this by default is using port 80, so that should send a signal or should be captured by our container, our Nginx server, and then pass that over to our Django server. So there's something missing here. So if you go back into your Docker file, well, let's just close everything down. So if we go back into the Django Docker file here, sorry, Docker Compose file, sorry. Let's go into our web here. So what's happening here, remember, is that why could we access Django still on port 8000? Well, because we've opened the port up in the container. We're mapping across 8000 port to the container. So that's still being recognized as a way of entering the container and accessing our website. So we want to make a few changes here. So we want to go from ports, and now we just want to use expose. So we just want to expose. So we don't want to map our computer's 8000 port over now to this container. We just want to expose 8000 and make that available to enter the container. So let's do that. We'll just stop everything and we'll give this a go. So I'll just go ahead and shut everything down. Again, this isn't necessarily something you have to do, but I'm just starting from a blank slate, so we're all working on the same page to avoid any issues. Okay, so I won't say that again, but I will continue doing that. So I'm just going to use Docker Compose up. So I'm just going to rebuild everything again. So we go back into our browser here. We'll just use 127.0.0.1. So that's port 80. And it still looks like we've got issues. So in actual fact, if we look at the configuration of our containers, either in the desktop container section here, in our Docker desktop, or else if you're utilizing the extension, Docker extension, you can see the square. This is representing the fact that the container isn't actually coming up. It looks like we've got a problem. So if we have a look in here, it actually tells us here that there's an error in our configuration. So unexpected curly brace there in looks like line 3. So it looks like we've got some sort of syntax error. So let's just go back into our configuration file and have a look. So the problem we've got here is a syntax error. So the semicolon hasn't been utilized there on line 3. Similar here, we've forgotten our semicolon. Let me just bring that back in so we can see more of the code. So there's a few different semicolons that we've missed out there. So what we can do is just reload. Let's have a look. Let's see if we can start up. And there we go. So you can now see that the server has started with this new configuration. So let's go over to our browser and refresh. And there we go. So we are just using port 80. So it looks like everything is successful. So now when we try port 8000, you can see that it doesn't now work. So we can only access our server now on port 80 through our Nginx server. So we still have the problem of the admin static files. So if we go into admin, we can see that the CSS files aren't being picked up. It can't be found. And it probably tells us, if we go into the code here, it probably tells us it's not found. Yep. So this is the web referring to the web container. It's telling us that we can't find the static files because they don't exist yet. So let's go ahead now and create that path and alias to those static files. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a shared volume. So we're going to share a volume from the web container over to the Nginx container. So let's make a new volume here. So this is going to be called static. Let's just call it static files or whatever you want. And that's going to be mapped across to user slash src slash app static files. So if you remember user src app static files, let's go back into our Docker file here. Remember, that's where basically on the container Django is currently installed, user src app. So what we're doing here is we're getting that area, user src app, and then the folder static files that we created earlier. So if you remember, we built the static files. Now those static files named that incorrectly, static files. So that's the folder there of static files. And I want to mirror that across, if you like, or make it available on my Nginx server. Apologies. Let's take that out of Nginx for now. That should be, sorry, in the web. Apologies. So that's currently where the static files are. So now what I can do is I can now reference this in Nginx container. So this is the Nginx container. I say static files again, and this time I'm going to place it somewhere in my folder directory. So I've got a folder called home, and then app, and then static files. So that doesn't exist yet on Nginx, so we need to build that before we actually copy that across. That's going to be important. So let's just close everything down. And then in addition to that, what I'm going to need to do is just share those volumes. So let's just say volumes and then static files. Okay, so we've essentially just shared a location, and the files are now kind of being copied over to the Nginx container. Ooh, get that right. So the files are being copied across to that. Now then, let's go into Nginx Docker file, because what we're going to need to do here is basically create, when we start up the image or create the image, we're going to need to run the mkdir, so make directory. Now, if we are making directories with kind of multiple directories, subdirectories, then we're going to need to use the P flag for that, so we can do that. Otherwise, we get an error. So home, that exists. So we're going to make a new folder called app, and then a new folder in here called static files, and that's where we're going to keep the static files. Right, so let's go back into here. Let's go back into our containers. We're just going to remove all the containers. Oh dear. Nope, 1 second. Let's just remove all the containers. And then the image. So we just start from scratch again. Okay, so that just removes all the containers and images. There's plenty of ways of doing that. Again, I'm just doing it manually. So let's go ahead now and just make sure everything's going to be in place. So we've mirrored across the statics folder. That's going to copy across all the files. Okay, so once that's done, we now want to serve them from Nginx. So let's go into Nginx configuration file, and let's make a new entry. So what we're going to need to do here then, create a new location. I do that. I said location and my brain just writes localhost. All right. Okay. Location, static, and then let's go ahead and create an alias. So basically what we're doing here is we're saying this location, static, this address, we want to basically hook this to a location in our folder system, static files. Don't forget the semicolon. Okay, so that's pretty much what we've done there. We basically mapped across this URL that the user could type in over to this folder location in our file system. And that's obviously then going to serve the static files. So just before actually bringing that up, I just noticed that I've used a capital V there. That was in the Docker Compose file. That probably isn't going to work correctly. So made that change there in the Docker Compose file, lowercase v. Let's go ahead now and Docker Compose up. So again, we're rebuilding all the images, and that's then going to bring up the containers. So hopefully this time we can now go over and refresh on the admin page, and you can see now we have access to all the CSS files and so on. We've got the render correctly rendered, the page correctly rendered. There we go. So for the final task, and here's an optional activity here, we're just going to now re-enable our DNS server. So this has already been set up previously. So I won't go through this step by step because it's just already there. But first of all, just close down the containers. Let's bring up or back up the code here for DNS. We'll just remove these volumes to the bottom. Okay, so this basically will allow us to create domain names, actual domain names that we can configure in our local area here, in our local development environment here in our machine. So we're just simulating a DNS server. If you don't know what a DNS server is, essentially it's a way of translating a domain name into an IP address so it can be routed across the internet and then access the services that you intend to access. So for example, when you type in Amazon.com, the internet router devices, they cannot understand or route that name. It needs to be translated into an IP address first. So that's where the DNS server comes in, right? So this allows us to make up any domain name we want because we're going to be working locally, right? So everything has already been set here. You can see that it uses port 53, the default port, and then we've got some configuration files here which we're going to utilize, and this basically just starts the service. So let's go into our DNS here. We've got some zones. So zones basically represent domains in this case. So let's just remove secondary.com. And then in addition to that, let's just make sure that we've removed it from our zone here in our name.config file. So there's nothing we need to change here in this file here. If you want to know a little bit about this, then head back to the previous tutorial where I go through this step by step. So that's our domain. That points, you can see, to our zone information here. So originally we set up this domain as ns.main.com. So we're just going to use main.com in this case. So here we have the name of the domain. We have an email address. Notice it uses dot and not the @ That's just the format we utilize. Some parameters about how this will get updated via other DNS servers, etc. And then here we have information which will help us then point towards the IP address that's kind of hosting that information related to the domain. So here, let's get rid of NS. So here what we have is at ns.nameservermain.com, and this is at the moment what we have. We're pointing to this IP address. So anyone who kind of requests the name main.com, it comes to this DNS server, and then it translates it into this IP address, which is just our local host. So let's just turn that into an @ Oh, what we're doing, press the wrong button. Let's go back. So @ and then in a, okay, 127 blah blah. So we could also include www in, so this is an A record, 127.0.0.1. So if anyone uses like www.main.com, it's going to get translated to this IP address. Okay, so that's pretty much all the configuration we need to do at this point for that. Now for the tricky bit. So here I'm using Mac. Okay, so I do need to go into the network preferences, and I will need to change the network preferences. So here I'm using a connected LAN connection. So I need to go to advanced here and just go ahead and go to DNS and change my DNS. So I need to change that to my local host. And that's basically just telling the computer this is where the DNS server is. So if I press apply, now my machine should be utilizing that DNS server, which is obviously in the Docker container, and that should then resolve or return essentially to my browser 127.0.0.1, and then that would take me then over to my Nginx server and then resolve the web page request, and then should return the web page. So let's just test to make sure. I've opened up a new bash shell. So don't forget, sorry, I didn't mention, I did already go ahead and bring the server up. So I did a Docker compose up again to bring up that container, that new container. Sorry if I didn't do that. So once that's done, I've opened up a new bash shell, ns.lookup, nslookup, and then main.com. And you can see that's now returning a result. So name main.com is at this address here. So it looks like everything's okay. So if you're on Windows, it's going to be slightly different. You'll need to go into network settings and set up DNS that way. Apologies, I don't show you in this tutorial how to do that, but it's going to be slightly different on Windows, right? So once that's done, let's go back into now our browser, and we should now just be able to type main.com, and there we go. So there's our website. So we should still be able to serve the static content. Yep, there we go. And there we have it. So that was setting up Nginx then as a reverse proxy utilizing Django. That does take us on our way, or on a pathway if you're thinking about deploying Django. That does take us forward in terms of actually starting to think about deploying Django utilizing Nginx and Gunicorn. So there we go. We now have this exact setup here. So our browser sends a DNS request to our DNS server, which is in a container. We then return the IP address, which can then send a signal to our Nginx server, which is also hosting our static files. Obviously, it passes our reverse proxy server, passes that data across, as well as some other information, our header information, over to our Gunicorn server, which can then communicate with Django. And then, of course, Django then checks the URL, so if it matches an existing URL that it has already configured, and then it will send information back through our Gunicorn, Nginx, and our browser. So we will utilize this setup further to explore a little bit more about Nginx. We could have a look at caching or caching. That's something that we can definitely now have a look at utilizing Nginx. So we'll continue this series, looking at other aspects, utilizing this and any other setup that you might want to request. So please, if you have any requests, you want to set this up with React or any other framework, then please let me know and I'll try and accommodate you. Thank you very much for listening. Just a big thank you to the channel members. Thank you for your continuing support. If you do wish to support the channel further, you can do by potentially joining our channel membership or potentially following us on Patreon. If you would like to, you can also follow us on any of these socials, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and of course we do have a Discord channel. I do try and hang out now and then, but I can't guarantee that I'm ever going to answer your questions on any of these socials here because it's way too much for me to do. But I do try as best I can, particularly the channel members. So if channel members do ask questions, typically in YouTube, I do try and access those first and reply. So thank you very much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.